Hello guys, and welcome back to the Summer Day Studios YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Hypershade editor again, and we're going to be taking a bit of a more focused deep dive look at the different properties that make up a material, like diffuse, like roughness, like transmission, bump, normal, all of those things that might be a bit confusing. You might have kind of a general idea of what they do, but you're not really fully sure how to use those to make a material. So the plan is today is to kind of go over each one of these key aspects of a material, give examples of how they affect this lovely little statue guy that we have here, just his head. Don't know where the rest of the body is. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a better understanding of how these work. So if I go and open our Hypershade editor up at the moment, I just have a AI OpenPBR surface. We are using Arnold, which comes prepackaged with Maya. You might also just be using a standard surface material. These concepts still apply. Some of the settings might look a little different. Some of the wording might be a little bit different. Same goes for basically any other render engine. The actual material you'll be using will have a different name. Some of the inputs will be in different places. It's basically all the same thing as far as 3D rendering is concerned, even across software. So this will be transferable regardless of what you do, even if you're using Blender or anything else. But just bear in mind it will be in different places, but the concepts are the same. So I just have this material applied at the moment, and this is just a blank canvas. We haven't done anything to this. It's got the default color, the default everything. Okay, so you'll probably know this already, but diffuse essentially is just the color information of your asset, right? Under base here you have color, and typically you'll use what's called a diffuse map for that. Okay, you can just literally change the color of this, but color information generally, you in a realistic rendering way, you only want that to contain literally just color information, no highlight information, no shadow information. All of that will come from the lighting naturally, as it would in real life. So you could plug in a color, a material, a map into this if you wanted to. You could just adjust the color as you see fit here. And this one is very, very straightforward and probably the shortest one that we'll talk about today. The next key one, which has a little bit more complexity to it that we're going to take a look at, is metalness, and these are just under the base for the OpenPBR surface. Again, it's kind of straightforward in the wording. The metalness essentially just affects how metallic an object is. By default, whenever you create a new material, it's going to be set to 0, as in we have 0 metalness. So it is by default a little shiny, but if you imagine that's more like plastic. If you look at plastic, it could have some shine to it, but if you look at metal, it's generally going to have more of a reflectivity of the world around it and take on those colors and sort of a rough yet shiny appearance, like a gray, like a gunmetal, right? Or a gold as well, or copper, or anything like that. But generally, we'd associate metals with like steel and iron, right? If I go ahead and render this, just because it's going to be easier for us to see here. If I bump the metalness from 0 all the way up to 1, you can see now we have a quite metallic look, right? It looks like this is made out of some sort of steel or tin or aluminium. And generally you can do half values of this if you want to, but if you're going for an actual metal, you're better off just having this all the way up at 1, and then driving the roughness in a different way. You might be wondering how we can change the color of this, because if we increase the metalness all the way to 1, the color information actually gets grayed out and we can't change what this looks like anymore in terms of the actual color material. So what if you wanted to make a gold? Well, you just pop the metalness down to something like 0.999 or something. So it's basically fully metallic. And then with the color here, you could change this to anything. We could make this red, or more of a gold color simply just by setting it to yellow. So you can see, to create sort of different types of metals, basically what you're looking for at a simple, at the most simplistic level, is to have metalness and then adjust the color to whatever you see fit, for whatever kind of metal you're trying to make. We can even make it darker like this. So yeah, that's the metalness. The next thing to move on to, which I think a lot of people get confused with, is the specular. And we've got all sorts of things in here like weight, specular color, IOR, which stands for index of refraction, roughness, anisotropy. I always have a hard time pronouncing that one. But let's just demystify some of this. So specular is essentially how reflective or shiny a surface is, and roughness affects how rough a surface is. So if you imagine the reason why surfaces are shiny in the first place, like a mirror or metal or a very shiny plastic, is because on a microscopic level, that surface is very even. It's very level. If we were to zoom in really, really close with a microscope, you'd see that the surface is very, very smooth. That's why if you polish something, even like a ball of mud, right, which I think is a hobby in some countries, I can't remember exactly where, if you polish it, eventually it smooths out the surface, it smooths out the bumps, and it becomes more and more shiny. So all that roughness is how rough on a more microscopic level the surface is. If you look at brick, the reason why brick isn't reflective is simply just because when the light comes in, the surface of it is so bumpy and undulated at such a small level that the light gets scattered and diffused in all directions, right? Whereas if a surface is very shiny, the light more cleanly bounces off of it, which is why you get cleaner reflections, if that makes sense. So if I was to set the roughness all the way to 0, our light here isn't really helping us, but if I come to the back, you can see we're getting a very, very shiny elements here, like we're sort of covered in water, or this is very polished marble or plastic surface. As opposed to if I was to put this all the way up to 1, you can see now we have a very matte surface. The light is very diffuse across the surface. So in essence, what you want to think of here is at 0, this is if this surface is very, very highly polished. Nothing really has 0% roughness unless you're trying to make like a mirror. Okay, but even then, you know, there's minor imperfections. But at a basic level, if you want completely shiny, you'd have it around 0. And if you want it to be completely rough, you'd have that at 1. But you can also plug roughness maps into this to affect this in more interesting ways rather than just a numeric value between 0 and 1. So that's how that works. The next thing we can look at is specular color. Now, specular color is pretty straightforward. Generally, I find that you leave this at white, but you can change this in some instances for like metallic car paint and things like that. But if I was to change this to red, you can see we're getting a sort of red rim around as if this was being highlighted by a red light. What this is doing is it's just making the highlights of our specular reflections red. We could make it any other color as well. You can see if we make it more of a yellow, we're getting yellow. Blue, we're getting blue. But generally, you're going to leave this at white, okay? Index of refraction is a little bit more complicated. You generally won't plug a map into this, and by default, it will be at 1.5. But all the index of refraction, or IOR, is essentially how much light bends when going through or interacting with a surface. And this will vary depending on what you're doing. If I was to click this little, these 3 lines here, you can see we have a few different types of materials like diamonds, glass, ice, olive oil. And this will vary depending on what it is. So for example, water might have an index refraction of 1.3, but the majority of objects are going to have an IOR of 1.5. And the difference visually is negligible, but it is important if you're going for really, really realistic rendering. But I would say just for your general purpose work, on average, leave this at 1.5. If you're doing a water or an ice or something like that, 1.3 is good as well, for glass too. But 1.5 is generally fine. For today, anisotropy is not really something you need to worry about, so we'll just move on to the next one. Transmission. This can also just be known as how see-through the object is. By default, this is going to be 0, 2. If you wanted to create a glass, you might put this all the way up to 1. And you can see now our head looks like it's made of glass, or at least a very, very translucent plastic. You can adjust the color here as well. If I was to set this to red, again, you can see this now gives us a bit more of a reddish tint to the glass. But by default, you're probably going to set that to white unless you're going for a glass that has a bit of a tint, like a green bottle, for example. Or maybe a green plastic bottle too. Since transmission, you're essentially going to be using different variants of this depending on how transparent your material is. And you can create interesting combinations with this. So by default, the roughness is at 0.1, right? So this looks like kind of a slightly frosted, a bit bumpier glass, but if I was to set this to 0, you can see now it looks almost perfect, like crystal. If I was to put this all the way up to more like let's go with 0.4 or something, it's a bit more like a frosted glass, like something you would have on like a bathroom or a toilet window, for example. So essentially that's all that transmission is. And again, you can use maps to drive this too. But if you're going for a general translucent material, whether that's like a rubber or a plastic or a glass, you're going to want to leave the color just at white there. And there's a whole bunch of different properties here, but just for general use, I wouldn't worry too much about these for the time being for making most materials until you start getting into things like orange juice or milk and stuff like that. So I'll just put the weight back to 0 for that. Next is subsurface, which is something that does confuse people. Essentially, all that subsurface is the way or how much light will penetrate beneath a surface before bouncing back. So if you imagine, we've all done this when we were kids, and you still see it on a regular basis too. If you're in a dark room or outside at night and you have a torch, flashlight, and you shine that behind your hand, you'll notice your hand glows very, very bright red. The reason for that is because the light is going into your body, into your hand, and it is scattering around a bit underneath there, subsurface scattering, hence the name. And obviously the inside of your hand, there's a lot of red stuff, like blood and your muscle and everything like that. So when the light comes back out, you're seeing the kind of internal elements of that, if you like. You're seeing the scattering, that red color. You'll often see it on people's ears in the sun and things like that. And you get it on all sorts of things, like rubber as well. Any material that is slightly more porous, you'll get subsurface scattering. You won't get it on things like brick, for example. Because the light just gets incredibly diffused. It doesn't get as absorbed into it as much as your hand would. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can use subsurface here. Maybe I'll change the color to a bit more of a pinkish sort of skin tone or something close to it. Something kind of like this, whatever, that'll do. Okay. If I increase the subsurface just to 0.4, you can see all of a sudden this surface now, it's quite hard to see and sort of describe exactly what's going on, but you can see it looks a bit more sort of porous, a bit softer, a bit more like maybe a porcelain or a marble, and that's because the light is now going beneath the surface and bouncing around. If I was to change the subsurface color to something like red, what's now happening is it's as if like on our hand, and obviously most people's hand aren't going to look exactly like this with the colors the way they are. But you can see that we have this kind of red tinge to things now. That's because the light is going beneath the surface and the color underneath the surface, the subsurface color, is red. So that is what is getting reflected back out to us. Okay. You can set this all the way to 1 and it starts to look a bit crazy. But for a subsurface material, generally, you would want to have this quite high. So you can see now this looks a lot more kind of like rubber, a more porous material. If I was to go ahead and use one of the preset materials here, which you can access from up here, this is a great way, by the way, if you want to just create a simple material right off the bat. They've got all sorts from blood to clay, ceramic, foam, glass, gold, that kind of thing. But if I set this to skin, which is in just here, and then replace, you can see that's also making use of subsurface by a little bit, and it's set the subsurface color here. So essentially that's all that is. It's like that effect when you shine a light behind your hand. And again, this is useful for things like skin, rubber, latex, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's just reset this back to a gray material. The next one we're going to have a look at is coat. Now, coat is essentially like applying a layer on top of things. If you imagine you had a wooden table and you then varnished it with some sort of like clear coat varnish or glossy varnish or something like that. You have the wood material beneath and you have the varnish on top. It's like a separate layer. That is essentially what coat is. If I increase this to 1, okay, and then adjust the roughness and put that all the way to 1, okay, so that's as rough material as possible. You can see this still looks really, really shiny. And if you can pick up on it here, hopefully on YouTube, essentially what this looks like is, like I said, if you imagine the material, if I turn the coat all the way to 0 again, this is very, very rough, kind of stone looking material. But if I turn this all the way to 1, it's like it's being coated in some sort of like glossy varnish, right? So the roughness beneath this now is only affecting the material below. This is kind of simulating a varnish. There isn't literally a physical layer on top of here, but you can see it simulating that, or kind of like a glazed clay pot or something like that. You can also adjust the roughness of this coating as well. So I could put that all the way to 1 as well, if you wanted a slightly more rough varnished look. But that's what that's for, essentially, like varnished materials, or potentially like car paint that has an extra clear coat on top, that sort of thing. You can also adjust the color of this too. We can make that red, so you're getting kind of like a very jade looking material when you do this. And that's essentially what you use coat for. I don't use it too often, to be fair, but when you do need things like varnish-esque materials, it's very, very good for stuff like that. Or even just making things look wet sometimes as well. It can be handy for that too. Fuzz, okay. Again, that might not be 100% clear what it is right off the bat. So fuzz, if you ever look at cloth, right? Let's say you have a blanket material or even a t-shirt, and when the light kind of brushes over it in a certain way, you have this kind of almost shimmery, potentially white, fuzzy look around the edges, and that's caused by the tiny fibers that make up that material. This is really, really good for when you want to simulate things like cloth and velvet, for example. If I just go ahead and set the preset here to velvet, luckily we have one, you see this kind of sheen, this color on the top here. Well, that is caused by the fuzz. If I was to turn this all the way to 0, you see we don't have it anymore. And you'll notice this was with materials like velvet. When you look at them from certain angles, they have this kind of sheen to them, and in order to make them look realistic in 3D, it's important to make use of the fuzz, and we have roughness for that as well. You can also change the color. If I was to make this white now, you see we've got a white fuzz, and like I said, essentially what this is doing is it's simulating the tiny microfibers that make up your material, and this is just light kind of getting diffused at the edges of certain angles due to the actual physical makeup of that material. Generally, the fuzz color you'll want to set to be a kind of brighter color than the base here. You can see the base is quite a dark, deep purple, but the fuzz is a more vibrant purple. So if you had a red material, for example, like a red fabric, you'd want the fuzz color to be a brighter red too, if it was a dark red, for example. So yeah, that's what is, you'd use this for fabric materials, basically. Let's go ahead and just quickly reset this back to how we had it before. And let's look have. Okay, so let's take a look at emission now, after fuzz. Emission essentially allows you to make your material emit light. If I was to go ahead and reduce the intensity of our light here way down, so this is nearly fully dark, and then come back to our material, and I was to put emission all the way at 1, you can see our object is now emitting light. Now, it doesn't look particularly natural. It's like we're looking at some sort of like LED bulb. And you can whack this luminance all the way up to like 10,000 or something and make it really, really bright. But this will emit light. If I was to create a plane, just scale this up here, rotate it. You can see this is being illuminated by the emission. If I was to put this at 0 now, you can see it's no longer being lit. You can change the color of this too. This is really, really useful if you want to do things like buttons, which have a kind of a luminance to them and things like that. Or if you're doing some kind of like sci-fi thing and you have inlays in like a weapon or like some kind of, I don't know, like energy pipe, stuff like that, then you might have a material that has some emission on it. So essentially that's all that's used for. So the last one is bump mapping or normal mapping. They are a little bit different. Normal maps look different to bump maps. But we'll do a bit more of a demonstration of this one just to show you how that works. So if we open up the Hypershade editor, and we open up the geometry here, you can see we have bump mapping, and it's just an input for that. So you could just plug a texture straight into this, but typically you need some sort of node between it. I'm just going to use a bump 2D node for now. Don't worry too much about this. This is kind of just a general introduction to what each of these inputs do. And I'll plug that into the normal camera. Again, I'm just going to take any old 2D texture built into Maya. I'm just going to take a noise, okay? And then just plug that in. Okay, now if we come back to our render, you can see we now have a bit of a lumpy guy. We've got the noise is being used to create bump mapping. So the geometry of this isn't actually changing at all. It's just a very, very clever trick used in 3D to create detail where there is none through texture maps. The geometry hasn't been modified at all. If I look at the topology, you can see it's in no way reflecting what we have going on here in the texture. But the noise is adding this detail for us, and this is good for things like pores on skin, tiny little itty bitty scratches, anything that's too small realistically to have modeled in that doesn't make sense, because if you're doing a character model, you might not model in all the pores. That would be a bit crazy unless you're going for some sort of incredibly realistic close-up shot, right? You can adjust the bump depth. Sorry. You can have this minus, which means it goes more in, or concave into the surface, and we can make this more positive as if it comes more out of the object. And if I was to set this to 0, then it would do nothing. And we just have our material as it is, despite the material being plugged in. So that is essentially how all of those parameters work, to give you a kind of basis of where to start. It can be a bit daunting if you're trying to create a material. I would generally encourage people to use PBR textures, and if you're not sure what PBR textures is, I can definitely make another video on that to explain how they work. I've used them throughout a lot of our videos to add materials to things. You definitely can build materials just using the node editor, and that is incredibly daunting. I've made a few videos on how to create certain materials, and if you have any materials in mind that you want to make but you're not quite sure how to tackle it, definitely do leave a comment. I absolutely love to see those, and I can make a video on how to make that specific material. Or if any of this didn't make sense, which is highly likely. It took me a very long time to learn what all of these do, and I'm still learning. Sometimes I'll still see something like, oh, I don't know what that is. And that will always be the case, right? But that's good. Please do let me know too. And hopefully I can help explain that a bit more to make this seem a bit more easy and understandable for you, because it's a difficult subject. So yeah, again, hope that was incredibly helpful. If not, please do tell me in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.